Welcome, everyone. I'm John Opdycke, president of Open Primaries. Welcome to our virtual discussion today. Before we start, let me lay out quickly how today is going to go. I'm going to introduce our guests in just a moment and ask them some questions. And after 15 or 20 minutes, I'll open it up for all of your questions. As Russell just mentioned, to ask a question, go into the chat feature of Zoom, type your name and your state and a one-sentence synopsis of your question. And then I'll call on you to ask it. I'm not going to ask your question for you. We'll take you off mute, ask your question, and put you back on mute. And then in the midst of our conversation, I have a very special announcement as well. So stay tuned. That's going to come up around 2:30, 2:35. All right, let's jump right into it. I'm very pleased to welcome the leadership team of Florida All Voters Vote. Gene Stearns, Mike Fernandez, Glenn Burhans, and Steve Vancore. This is an extremely accomplished and impressive team. Gene Stearns is the chairman of Stearns Weaver Miller, one of the most prominent law firms in Florida. He was also recently named by Chambers USA as the single most respected commercial litigator in the entire state of Florida. That's some accomplishment. Mike Fernandez is the chairman of MBF Healthcare Partners and is one of the most significant philanthropists in Florida. He serves on the board of trustees of the University of Miami and Loyola University, Maryland, has been a significant force within the immigration reform community, and has received just about every business and community service award there is in Florida and around the country. Glenn Burhans is a shareholder at Stearns Weaver and is the chairman and the chief legal counsel for the All Voters Vote campaign. He's a brilliant attorney who most recently argued in front of the Florida Supreme Court and defeated efforts by both the Attorney General and the Democratic and Republican parties to keep Amendment 3 from appearing on the ballot this year. And finally, Steve Vancore is the president of Vancore Jones Communications. Steve has run literally hundreds of campaigns throughout Florida. He's regarded as one of the top pollsters and strategists in the entire state. He also teaches media at Florida State University's master's program and is the host of a regional television show, The Usual Suspects. So welcome, the four of you. Thank you for joining us today and taking some time. Yeah. So before we get into questions, I just want to lay out the basics for everyone on the Zoom today, so everyone knows what we're talking about. Florida is a closed primary state. 27% of voters, that's 3.7 million Floridians, are registered independents, and they're barred from voting in primaries. The All Voters Vote campaign gathered over 1 million signatures to place a referendum, it's now Amendment 3, on the November 2020 ballot to enact nonpartisan open top 2 primaries for all state and statewide offices. Top 2 is already used in Florida at the municipal and the county level in virtually every area of the state. So this November, voters in Florida will have the opportunity to vote on whether to extend the top 2 system to include state and statewide races. So Gene, I want to start with you. You launched All Voters Vote 6 years ago. And I know that you were one of the key drivers behind the effort to reform gerrymandering in Florida prior to that. So what motivated you to focus on primary reform and launch All Voters Vote back in 2014?
John, thanks. It really is a very simple analysis. A little over 30% of Florida's voters are registered as non-party affiliated voters, which means that they, as you all know, excluded from participation in Republican and Democratic primaries, not only for the legislature, but also for statewide elected officers. The consequence of that is when you go around the state of Florida, most counties, most districts are either going to be electing a Republican or a Democrat based on just simple demographics. Democrats tend to live in urban areas. Republicans tend to live in less populated areas. That's why when you see the post-election, the sea of red, if it was just purely geography, would consume the small lakes of blue. But there are more people living in the blue areas than in the red areas. Now, Florida did go through a process of apportionment change when we passed what is called fair districts, which established standards for districting and that's helped. But realistically, it's only part of the issue, because now our districts are drawn more rationally. But once again, that leaves progressive Democrats in blue areas and very, very conservative people living in the red areas. Florida has another feature in its electoral system that's not that unusual, which is a plurality in a primary wins. So you can take a typical county, which might be, for example, 50% Republican, 30% Democrat, and 20% non-party affiliated, or some combination thereof.
Right.
And a plurality of one party dictates the outcome. That will be true in both Democratic districts and Republican districts. And the consequence of that is the most extreme elements on both sides of the political spectrum dominate the outcome. And the worst thing is it puts the elected officials in handcuffs. They can't really address issues. They can't cross the aisle. They can't have an intelligent conversation, because they can never offend that minority of people that have an agenda that you simply have to accept it. And you can look at examples on the left, you can look at examples on the right, but the consequence of all of this is major things that the state needs to address aren't being addressed. They're hamstrung by this process. The ill will among the partisanship simply has become so extreme that just nothing worth accomplishing that's good for the state is getting accomplished. My experience as a young man, I used to work in legislature before I went into private practice of law, and Republicans and Democrats used to talk to each other. That isn't
Right.
the case anymore. So to me, it's probably the most important issue in facing any state in the United States of America, and the state of Florida, I think we all recognize, is critical to the future of the United States of America.
Great, thanks, Gene. Mike, let me turn to you. You joined Gene and the All Voters Vote effort a couple of years ago in 2018. Prior to that, you were a very significant player in efforts to enact bipartisan immigration reform. Do you see a relationship between those two issues? Do you think fixing the primary system might help unlock progress on that issue and other policy issues that you care about?
I think they're closely related, John, and thank you for the time for all of you. Actually, we started a fund to deal with immigration issues and use the capital that we had raised to try to influence politicians to be more reasonable in their approach to immigration. And what we learned is they were all willing to take our money, but when it came down to it, few were willing to step outside of the box, and that caused us to consider alternatives. And this was the one alternative that we thought that if it could be accomplished, which we had. Gene was always a believer in this. I had my doubts early on, and I just came convinced that this is the way to change not only the immigration issue, but a lot of the evils that we see in election nowadays, and the partisanship that we have seen, and the extremism that we have seen. By the way, I'm always given a Zoom camera that has a Cuban accent, so I hope you understand me what I'm saying. This is something that is important to all of us. We've been able to do almost what everyone counted against us on. We've managed to receive over 1 million signatures in support of this effort. We have managed to get it approved in 67 out of 67 counties. With an incredible team, we faced both the Republicans and the Democrats at the Florida Supreme Court, and both wanted us dead. And we prevailed. So for the first time in over 100 years, there's an opportunity in Florida to change the way the state behaves during elections. And I think this is a one-time shot in a lifetime, probably, that we have everything going in our favor, including the polling that seems to be on our side, to manage to get this done. And we hope that we can ask you to join us in this effort as we move forward.
Thanks, Mike. Let me turn it to Glenn now. Glenn, you recently won a big court case against, it seemed like everybody in Florida was suing you, the Attorney General, the Democratic Party, the Republican Party. They tried to keep Amendment 3 from even appearing on the ballot. So what what arguments did the parties make in trying to keep this off the ballot? And did the court say anything that you found particularly important in rejecting those claims?
Yes, thanks, John. So let me set the stage for the parties and the AG's attack on the amendment by first briefly describing the legal framework in Florida. Not only do we have to have an amendment that complies with the law if it were enacted, but even in order to get to the ballot, you have to jump through some procedural hurdles, one of which is getting approved for ballot placement by the Florida Supreme Court. And that court has a two-pronged test that's been developed over time. It's based on statute and a constitutional provision. And the first requirement, which relates to one of the questions I saw pop up, is the single subject requirement, that the proposed amendment only addresses one subject and it doesn't seek to alter or perform multiple functions of government. The second prong is whether or not the ballot language, that's the title and then the 75-word summary that voters will read, because you don't get the full amendment in the ballot box.
Right.
Whether that ballot language is clear and it discloses the chief purpose of the amendment. And so that first prong, the single subject, was not really at issue because there were probably 90 or 92 proposed amendments going back to 1968. And we reviewed all of the decisions involving those cases. So we really tried to carefully craft something that would satisfy both prongs. So we were able to take off the single subject requirement really just on the drafting alone. Now on the second prong, whether the language is clear, unambiguous, and informs voters of the chief purpose, that's where the Attorney General and the Republican and Democratic parties focused their efforts. And their primary argument was that we were not telling voters that we were going to do away with the closed party primary system as we know it, and that this would be a wholesale change in how primaries are conducted in Florida. Now, our response, and which was adopted by the court, was that you can't be more plain than what we've said in the ballot language, which was we would conduct these primaries for legislature, governor, and cabinet by allowing all registered voters to vote in the same primary election and on a ballot where all of the candidates would appear regardless of their party affiliation. And then the top two vote getters would advance to the general election. So the court really didn't give a whole lot of credence to that argument, and they felt that we clearly disclosed the impact upon the primary system.
Well, great work. I know so many reform efforts around the country get kicked off the ballot by the court. So really to get past that hurdle is a significant accomplishment. Great work.
Thank you.
Let me ask you, Steve Vancore, two questions. They're somewhat interrelated. First of all, what's the polling look like? Mike mentioned that there's strong polling. And secondly, something I've noticed is that the media in Florida is very supportive of this effort. I mean, I've read dozens of columns in favor of the Amendment 3. I know from talking to you that 6 editorial boards have already endorsed.
Right.
What is it about the Florida media that makes them so interested and supportive of fixing the primary system?
Thanks, John. It's a good question because they see what we see. They see the intransigence. They see that most elections are over in the primaries. They see, especially the columnists who write about campaigns, who write about politics, who write about the legislature. They see that these races are over in the primary. We have 120 House seats, and about 110 of them will be decided in the primary, where a majority of voters are legally prohibited from casting a ballot. In the Florida Senate, we have 20 seats up every other year. This year, 18 of them will be over in the primary, in which case, again, a majority of the voters, when you consider the minority party in that, whether it's the Republicans or the Democrats, plus the independents, they see that they're closed out of the process. And so the columnists in particular are the ones who are weighing in again and again in our favor. These are the ones who work for the papers, who now in today's new modern media world also serve on the editorial boards. So the editorial boards that have weighed in, as you noted, 6 of the 7 have already weighed in on our behalf with very little prompting from us. And what was interesting about the one that weighed in against us, they wrote their piece And Glenn Burhans used his persuasive powers that he did so well to court and wrote a letter to them explaining where they were mistaken about their opinion. It was the most interesting thing I'd ever seen, John. They wrote a rebuttal to Glenn's column and admitted they were wrong about their position, but basically said, yeah, we're still against it anyway. So I kind of saw that as bringing them to neutral. So your first question was about the polling. And it's no accident. We spent 3 years with Gene and Glenn's guidance on working the language to make sure it met with the legal compliance he said, but also that it was something that voters wanted and wanted to accept. It's no coincidence it's called the All Voters Vote Amendment. And every time we polled it, and we polled it several times, it always pops above 60%. But what I love the most about this, it doesn't just pop above 60%, which is, by the way, for those of you who are not from Florida, we have to get not only 1.1 million signatures, which we did, we also have to get 60% in a general election, which we hope to get. But not only does it score above 60% every single time, but the more voters learn about it, and we present them with the positives, and we present them with the negatives, and when they hear both sides, they grow in their support of this thing. So the polling has been fantastic.
That's great. That's really good to hear.
Yeah.
All right, we're going to open it up for your questions. Again, a reminder, if you want to ask a question, go into the chat feature, type your name and your state and a 1-sentence description of what you want to ask, and then I'll call on you and you can ask your question. So I'm going to start with John Fleming. John, you're up.
Thank you very much. This is a question directed for the Florida folks. Given the pandemic and what's happening with the coronavirus, how's that affecting your approach to how you traditionally run a ballot initiative campaign?
John, you want me to take that?
That's a Steve question.
Okay.
Hey, John Fleming, how are you? John is a fellow Tallahassee resident. It's affecting it a great deal because the very things that we were hoping to get started at this point, which is a lot more on the ground, public hearings. I think for a while, one of us on the team was giving an in-person speech about once a week at one point. Obviously that has shut down and a lot of the stuff has shifted to online, stuff like we're doing right here. It's also caused a pause in the fundraising as people are assessing where they are financially. It's very difficult to ask when people are struggling with the variety of things they're working on. But I see Gene smiling because I know what's going through Gene's brain right now too. It's also given the opposition the same pause. And remember, the opposition is largely the parties who are probably going to use their overflow money. And because they're behind, I'd rather be in our position, frankly, than their position at this point in time, simply because all campaigns have been paused. And so we're having to deal with that. It's probably going to be a matter of timing. And one last thought, what we're going to see is a dramatic shift in how people vote in the upcoming elections. You're seeing a very dramatic migration from election day to early to now vote by mail. Florida is traditionally a third, a third, a third. A third of the people will vote by mail, a third of the people will vote early, and a third of the people will vote on election day. That's probably going to be, in the general election, vote by mail will be north of 50%. So that's going to change some of the timing as well.
Great. All right, we have a question from Neil Simon in Maryland. Just by way of introduction, I know Neil. Neil is a very significant mover and shaker in the national reform movement. Actually just published a new book called The Contract to Unite America. So Neil, go ahead, you're on.
Thank you for that kind introduction. I think my question's for Gene, because I think, Gene, you were it sounds like the key to founding this whole initiative. And I'm so impressed with what you guys have accomplished in Florida, and congratulations to the whole team. It's so important what you're doing. I'm curious if you ever considered doing top 4 primaries or top 5 as opposed to top 2, and what the rationale was for choosing top 2.
Well, I think it became important to us to not try to be seen as inventing the wheel. That is to say, this is a major reform. It is a second step from redistricting reform. And the idea was that we had pretty good examples of how top 2 works around the country. And so we could point to those examples and believed that we needed to confine what we were doing to those that we could say it works. Also, by the way, if you think of the tradition of Florida, it's only recently that the legislature abolished runoff elections in the parties. And in connection with local elections for mayors and city council members and county commissioners, the top two system is used. So it was kind of like, let's not throw too many monkey wrenches into an electorate that is going into an election year, which is by itself challenging, to keep it as simple as possible. And this is as simple as possible.
John, may I add to that as well?
Yeah. Go ahead,
because one of the traps that we had to run was Gene had said, let's test everything. Let's test all the different various reforms. And we had to meet several criteria. We had to meet, as Glenn identified, the single subject and the ballot consistency. But we also had to make sure we started well above 60% because of the way these ballot dynamics run. And nothing, we tried nonpartisan elections, we tried the runoff elections, we tried non-disclosure of parties, we tried a variety of different features, and really the top two, all voters vote open primary, was the only one that consistently scored above 60%. So these were all considered, Neil, but they were rejected for different reasons.
Got it. All right, we have a question from Elena Ashburn in Broward, Florida. I know a lot of you. Elena is a high school student who works with a really great national organization called Civics Unplugged. So Elena, go ahead and ask your question.
Hey, I'm Elena. I'm a sophomore in high school and I live in Broward County. So me and my partner Daryl have been working really closely with John and Jeremy from Open Primaries to brainstorm ideas and create a project proposal for a social media campaign for All Voters Vote to really help get the word out there to Florida residents about the amendment that's going on the ballot this year. As you guys know, a majority of my generation and millennials, the generation like above me, are mainly in support for open primaries, but not a lot of them know that it's going to be on the ballot this year. Do you have any plans or ideas to help reach out to these different voter demographics?
You want to take that?
Steve, that's probably best you to start, but I'd like to share a few things about grassroots that we've got to get going, but I defer to you first.
Well, Jeffrey, I love the beard. So the short answer is yes. As you guys know, Broward County is my second home. I love it down there. And yeah, we're going to do a very aggressive outreach to younger voters, especially those with a history of voting, and we're going to use the channels that they're used to communicating on, which includes the suite of social media and other digital products as well. So other than a very simple, first of all, thank you, Elena, for your efforts and your engagement. It's fantastic. We're getting a lot of incredible feedback, and our polling shows young voters who tend to be less partisan, tend to be less joiners in a variety of ways, are more likely to say, I like the idea of not being excluded from being allowed to vote. So yeah, we're absolutely going to engage it. But Jeffrey, I'll give you the floor.
So on that, I've had the opportunity with leadership of Steve Huff, Jeremy Opdycke, and John Opdycke and Jeremy Gruber to talk with folks in the Florida community on a more grassroots level and try to drum up, call them soldiers, an army, to be able to get out there and communicate through devices such as Elena described as organic social media, rather than the C-suite stuff that you guys are working on. But we want to complement that. We want to be on the same page as you. We're looking for a little direction that we can hopefully take from this meeting ongoing. And we're also looking to get contributions from the grassroots community to get this done. For example, signs. Steve Huff has been talking about that. But before we create any, we certainly want to know the graphics you would approve and want to use, that Mike would want to, Mr. Fernandez would approve, and Gene as well. We want to work. We have a grassroots army developing. We're ready to hit the ground and start running. So we do need a little direction from you guys.
Okay.
Got it. Thanks, Jeff. All right, we have two people asking questions about some of the challenges and the expected opposition messaging and misunderstandings and so forth. So one is from Harry Kresky in New York. The other is from Bill Van Emberg in Florida. So Harry first, and then Bill, ask your questions, ask them both, and then the team respond to both those questions simultaneously. So Harry, you're up. Harry? Harry, you got to take yourself off mute.
Okay.
There we go. Harry? All right, I think we lost Harry. Why don't we just go right to Bill Van?
I'm back.
Oh, you're back. Okay. Hi, Harry.
So, top two and other forms of open primary have been on the ballot in a number of states. The newspapers generally support it. The reform community does, and many voters do, but it doesn't always win. And I think we can anticipate a bitter campaign. And I was wondering what the leadership team sees as the chief arguments that are going to be put forth by the opposition.
All right, before you guys answer, Bill, ask your question, and then you guys answer both of them.
Thank you. Yeah, along the same lines, but I was focusing more on what you hear from voters in terms of misunderstandings or objections. So from the standpoint of just when I'm talking with people about this and when thinking about the messaging that you're going to create for the voters, what kinds of things are coming up so that we can be prepared for that?
John, you want me to answer, or how do you want to?
Open to the team. Sure. Why don't you take points, Steve?
Well, let me offer this because they really overlap. Harry's question in particular, Bill is asking it from point of view of voters, and Harry's asking it from a point of view of the organized opposition. There seems to be one consistent message, and everything derives from it. And that one consistent message is, don't let them vote in our primaries. And when voters are confused, they're like, well, why should I let somebody else vote in my primary? And the parties, and mostly the extremes of both parties, are saying, don't let others vote in our primaries. And I think our first response has to be, these aren't their primaries. These are primaries that are funded by you, the taxpayer, and you, the voter, registered qualified voter, are being legally excluded from voting for the person who's going to represent you in Tallahassee. So those two things travel together. Well, I know Gene's been talking to folks, and Glenn has been on a lot of talk shows and other venues hearing the same things as well. And we saw those, and I'll leave the floor back to them, but we saw those same arguments in their filings. We've seen them in their guest columns. And when I've been on debate stages with them, that's the basic essence. These are our primaries. We own them. And our counter, of course, is no, these belong to the voters, and the voters should be allowed to vote in their primaries.
John, maybe if I could just make a comment here, if that's appropriate.
Yeah.
First of all, Steve Vancore did a phenomenal job in the early polling and the years we worked on messaging. And when you walk into the voting booth or when you get your mail-in ballot, the voters will be given a series of constitutional amendments to indicate whether they're for or against them. One of the first is, should you be a citizen to vote in Florida? Now, why the legislature thought that was important to put on the ballot is a question that it's the kind of reason we should do this amendment, because that's a stupid question. But it does initiate a conversation about ours, which follows later, which says, should all voters vote in all elections, including all candidates? Now, the other side has to say, no. I don't think all voters should vote. And I don't think all candidates should run to be selected by all voters. The truth is that what Steve developed through this process is the three words that matter are all voters vote. All voters vote. If there's a message to repeat over and over and over and over again on signs and marketing, because keep in mind the level of interest, while there's in the progressive community and frankly, in much of the conservative community to try to fix our problems, this is popular. most voters aren't going to focus on constitutional amendments until they walk in and cast a vote, and they're going to read the language. And as we've seen in the polling, they respond very favorably to the words that appear on this ballot. The Republicans and Democrats know that, which is why they try to kill it, because they call the language misleading because it's so darn persuasive. So everything we do from a marketing perspective, in my view, needs to be directed towards the language the voter is going to see on the ballot. All voters vote.
John, if I could just add, go ahead, Mike.
Just to add an additional point, and that is that especially during the Florida Supreme Court hearings, they seem, both sides made a point that this was a radical move that most people would not understand.
Right.
And the reality is that it's a self-serving argument that they were pitching, and the courts were able to see right through that and sided with us. This is not a radical approach in Florida. This is an approach in Florida that is used by most mayoral campaigns. So most mayors in most cities in Florida are elected using nonpartisan politics, judges, school boards, etc. So with that in mind, we have begun reaching out to key mayors in the state about being a voice for us in this process. And we are now in the progress of getting one of the cities, one of the largest cities in the state. The mayor is going to videotape a message that is addressing his peers throughout the state, saying this is not a radical approach. This is something that I agree with, and that's how you were elected also. So allow all voters to vote. So they're trying to confuse the voter as expected, and we're trying to use tools to counteract that.
That's such a compelling argument that this is a system already in place for mayors, for sheriffs, for school board, that people use it throughout the state. That's a very compelling argument. I have a question from my colleague, Jeremy Gruber, specifically to you, Mike, about the rise of independent voters. And so Jeremy, take it away. Jeremy, you got to take yourself off mute.
Sorry. Hi, everybody, and thank you. Mike, this question is for you because I know you recently became an independent voter, and we've been following the rise of independent voters around the country, but nowhere has there been such an increase as there has been in Florida. Almost a fifth of the country's, of all the independent voters in the entire country are now in Florida. And they are some of the most vocal folks in the independent voter movement for change. So as a new independent voter, as part of the independent voter community, Mike, I'm curious if your thoughts as to why there's been such a dramatic increase in Florida and why there's so much energy in that community for reform.
I think that it's just across the board, voters are fed up with the extremes that are being applied to both parties. We're a handful, a minority of people on both sides, the right and the left, seem to control the destiny of their country. And in Florida in particular, I think people are also fed up with the fact that this been one party has been in control of Tallahassee for as long as they have been. Look, I happen to be an adopted son of the United States. I was born in Cuba, and I saw what happens when a party becomes the single, they claim to be the single speaker on behalf of every resident in that community. And the more power they have, the more irresponsible they behave. And a lot of Republicans like me, I've been a Republican all my life. I've given a lot of money to the party. And in retrospect, it was, I wish I could undo it. So I am trying to undo some of it by participating in this effort. And there's a lot of people like me that even though on the surface they are supporting of the party's position, when it gets down to they're in the voting booth or checking off their voting card by mail, they will vote our way because their argument is that they fear retributions from the party. They have so much invested in the party that they feel they're going to be punished by speaking out against the party. Behind closed doors, when it's time to vote, they will not have that microscope on them.
Thank you.
That's great. All right, we have a lot more questions, and I really want to get to as many of them as possible. But before that, I have an announcement. So as everybody knows, campaigns cost money, a lot of money. And this is a very, very important campaign. And I will say this publicly, not just for Florida, but for the entire country. If we can get this done in Florida, it's going to change the national conversation about the primary system in all 50 states. So I'd like to raise $20,000 today to support the All Voters Vote team, to support this effort. They've done incredible work, and I really want to have us get behind them. So to help us do that, I have a special announcement today from one of our supporters, Marcus Wedner. So Marcus, take it away.
Oh, thanks, John. Yeah, look, I'm really excited by this effort, and in talking to John, talking to Jeremy about ways to help, the fundraising part of this. I agreed, my wife and I agreed to a challenge. So, and just by way of background, my wife and I, we give some money politically, we give more money charitably. She's more involved probably politically, than I am, but I guess it was a couple of months ago, she got invited and she had me come along to a meeting over at Stearns Weaver where I saw the whole team present, and they actually had a group of people from around the country who were engaged in similar open primary kinds of activities. Governor Schwarzenegger Skyped in to talk to the crowd. And I was just so impressed by the thoughtfulness and the data orientation and kind of the rational approach that had been, I think really represents what's going on with All Voters Vote. And then when I found out that due to Mike's generosity, that candidly most of the heavy lifting had been done, that is actually getting it on the ballot. At that point, it hadn't been through the last hoops that it eventually got through, but it sure was looking good then. This seemed to me, and I grew up in the investment world, this seemed to be as kind of close to a sure thing as you could find if you're trying to back winning horses. So these guys have gotten the ball all the way down, to use a football analogy, down to the red zone. And now with a whole bunch of effort and these things cost money, a bunch of money, they're in this amazing position to potentially have, John, as you're saying, not just have an impact on Florida, but an impact around the country. So we said that we wanted to make a very meaningful political contribution in the form of a challenge. So in the spirit, John, of what you're describing, we would like to challenge with a $10,000 contribution to the group on this call, with the hope that we could hopefully get to your 20,000 number, John, and hopefully a lot more than that, because it feels to me like if you're on this call, you're kind of already converted or partially converted, and you and probably your communities and your networks, you probably have really an outsized influence in terms of people looking to you for what opinions you have, whether it's about a candidate, whether it's about a cause, whether it's about something that is kind of wonky, maybe kind of boring, this structural voter reform. But it really is, in my view, kind of the foundation of everything else that you're trying to do if you're trying to improve, politics in this country.
Thanks, Marcus. That's very generous of you. And yes, the $20,000 I'd like to raise today is just today. It's a drop in the bucket, but I think would be very meaningful for this call today. So every dollar that we raise today will be matched by Marcus and his wife. So please wave your hand if you can give. And if you feel comfortable, enter your pledge in the chat box. You can donate right at the All Voters Vote website, and we'll be emailing you that information after the call. But please give as generously as you can. If you feel comfortable, put in how much you can donate in the chat box so we can keep our tally going throughout the call, see if we can hit our 20,000 by the end of the call. And now, thank you, Marcus. Let's go right back into some questions.
Okay. John, real quick, just on behalf of the committee, thank you very much, Marcus, and folks that I can see the pledges are coming, and that's fantastic, and we greatly appreciate all of that help. Thanks so much.
And I would add here on this contribution, Elena earlier, who's a high school student who's involved in this. I think one of the things that's very important to get commitments from young people is give $5, give $10, lunch, and the idea being that you start, there's actually something tangible you can do. And if I were asking Elena what you could do, that's what I would do. Start a network of people in social media to start raising. It doesn't have to be nickels and dimes, but it just get people involved to to show they're committed to the program.
That's great, great advice. All right, we have a question from Jessie Fields, Dr. Jessie Fields in New York, about the recent effort to restore felons' voting rights in Florida. Go ahead, Dr. Fields.
Okay, thank you, John. So my question is it's like a two-part question. One is the coalition, the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition, that, as everyone knows, won the initiative to restore voting rights to formerly incarcerated individuals. In 2018, that was a very dramatic success. 64% of voters voted for it. 5 million people, Democrats, Republicans, and independents. They managed to put together a coalition that was very inclusive, very diverse, and I think that it is very much somewhat of a model for this initiative. So I'm wondering if you are thinking about how to do that in a real way, to bring people together across party lines, across racial lines, across ideological lines. The second part of the question is, it seems to me that those 64% of voters, 5 million voters in Florida, across the board, more votes than any candidate got in that election, would be people who would be supportive of let all voters vote, in that what they've seen happen to the initiative that they supported is that the state legislature, which is insulated from the voters, distant from the voters, then went and changed the initiative, watered it down, made it, instituted fees and fines that were not even in the person's initial sentence, new fees and fines that a person has to meet in order to then be eligible to vote. So this is something that's, being litigated and so forth. But many people who were thinking they were going to go vote or register to vote were then very disappointed that they were not able to do that, and many fewer people are being able to take advantage of that initiative. So it seems to me that this is a demonstration of the way, in particular, the state legislature is distant and insulated and unresponsive, in fact, arrogant, to reverse something that was so strongly supported by the voters. So they are not listening to the voters. So I think that the argument for this initiative is that it opens up the process for everyone, and it helps to make the elected officials more accountable to the voters. It's good for everybody, all voters, to have a process that's more responsive. So I wonder if you are thinking of using that argument and reaching out to those voters and using that same kind of model.
John, let me take a stab at the first part of that, because there's two parts to that, right? One is the campaign process, Dr. Fields, and which you correctly identified. And the second one, by the way, I don't know if you heard, there was a great ruling from Judge Schinkel yesterday, which will hopefully be held up on appeal, which would undo a lot of what the legislature did in that regard. But I'll turn that second part of your question about after the fact over to the two attorneys on our team, Glenn and Jean. But we've already taken a play out of their playbook, which is the people who pushed for the Felons Restoration of Rights Act did similarly what we did, which is before they got that put on the ballot, they went and poll tested it and made sure that ballot language that Jean alluded to earlier, when they walk into the ballot box, very different dynamic, off-year election, first thing. Secondly, there was a ton of ballot items on there because we have this odd thing called the Constitutional Revision Commission. So there was 14 items on the ballot. We'll only have 4, but we did precisely what they did, which is poll test the ballot language to make sure the ballot summary is acceptable to the voters, that they understand that it is clear and consistent and something they would support. And like them, we're seeking to build and do our ballot language in particular, a very broad coalition, in that theirs was, one of compassion, right? If a person has served their time, has done their debt to society, they should be allowed back in the game. Likewise with ours was all voters should be allowed to vote. And we're hoping that momentum, because that has carried on because of the legislature's unwillingness to enact it, that has carried on to what Jean alluded to earlier. They're going to see this citizens being allowed to vote, which polls at like 85%. And now they'll see ours, which says all voters vote, which I would think if I voted, and I did, in support of Amendment 4, this looks like it's part 2 of that. But you nailed it. That's exactly right. And by
but I would add, John, I would add everything we've done in Florida that is moving the ball towards more participation and more honest government is resisted. the reapportionment legislation, the amendment we passed, ended up with vigorous litigation where the legislature simply tried to ignore it, and we won in court. Similarly, with the Judge Hinckley's order, he's now issued two very important orders. First, for an individual, that was affirmed by the 11th Circuit, and now a class action that involves all voters. And Judge Hinckley is a respected jurist, and unless there's been a major change in the 11th Circuit, that's going to pass. But I assume this as well, that we can't, if we win, and I hope we do, we're going to assume they're going to try to figure out every which way to not let it happen. But you can be assured of one thing, which is the legal skills that will be applied to this will be vigorous, and we're pretty good at what we do. But you know they'll be challenged. You know they'll find us every step along the way. And by the way, we also are not unmindful of the fact that one of the problems that came up with the restoration of voting rights was in arguing to the Supreme Court, one of the lawyers said in open court, oh, by the way, they'll have to pay their fines. Okay, and that became the principal argument for the legislature saying, oh, okay, we'll just make them pay their fines. That's why the Supreme Court approved the language. You can be assured Glenn Burhans didn't say anything like that that can be thrown back at us when we have to defend this amendment.
I'm glad we have Glenn on the case. All right, we have two questions from prominent Floridians, and then, and I'm going to tease this one a little bit, a question from Jackie Salet in New York about the presidential election. I don't know if you guys are aware there's a presidential election going on. So.
Surprise.
Yeah, but let me start with Ernie Bach, chairman of the Independent Party of Florida. Ernie. Ernie, you've got to take yourself off mute. Ernie, you there?
Hello. Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me now?
Yep, I can hear you, Ernie. Go ahead.
Great. Welcome to all and great work to everybody. Thank you for the matching contribution. I had the idea, rather than send you a couple $100, I'm going to take out an ad in the Tampa Bay Times and ask all the independents in our Tampa Bay area to match those funds. Just send me the name and address of the account I have to send to. I think we can probably raise a goodly amount. I see we've already raised $7,000 on a matching. That's great.
Great. Thanks, Ernie.
Thank you.
All right. Let's go to former Assemblyman Juan Carlos Planas from Florida. Go ahead.
Thank you. And it's a state representative.
State rep, sorry.
Member of the legislature between 2002 and 2010. And I can tell you that just in that 8 years, being a moderate Republican became harder and harder in those 8 years. We found that what was being driven by the party was hurting legislators' ability to vote their conscience. I saw this not just on my Republican colleagues, but there were Democratic colleagues who were constantly in trouble with their party leaders as well. And one of the things that I think it was Steve who said this, there will be Democrat and Republican legislators who will keep their mouths shut, but will vote for this because they realize that they are being hampered, they are being hamstringed. I get questions all the time if I'm ever going to run again, and it's very hard. Like Mike Fernandez said earlier, it's very hard to be a round peg in a square hole because of the fact that the partisanship has made what were old-fashioned Republicans and old-fashioned Democrats a thing of the past. When I was a legislative aide in the 1990s, the difference between Democrats and Republicans was almost minuscule in Florida. The Republicans took over, and as we eliminated the runoff election, it has become very, very, very partisan to the point that it's extremist. I think this is something that is needed, and the campaign has to focus on making sure that, you know, it's people represent the majority of the people, not just the small minorities that are making you know, the decisions. Additionally, this will take away weight from what becomes an automatic speakership run whenever any member gets elected to the legislature. It will make sure that the powers that be don't influence the speaker's race. you know, I can go privately with a lot of you on a lot of other issues that I witnessed, but I was very happy to see this and very happy to support it.
Thanks, Juan Carlos. All right, let me turn to Jackie Salent. A question about the presidential election. Go ahead, Jackie, you have the floor. You have to take yourself off mute.
There we go. Okay, gentlemen, hello. Here's something I've been thinking about, wondering your thoughts. Florida is going to be a hotly contested state in the presidential race in November. And I'm wondering if you think the presidential candidates will get drawn into the discussion about this issue. And if so, do you take that to be a good thing or a bad thing? Just interested to know how you see this issue being situated in what's going to be a very hotly contested environment.
I think they're all going to be very busy focusing on other issues. I don't think this is going to rise to that level of their radar screen. And I'm guessing that's true, but I will say this. This is one of the nastiest presidential elections, I think, already that we've ever seen. And my sense of it is the partisanship is going to drive more people towards this idea than away from it. I mean, when you have someone like Juan Carlos supporting this, who's one of the more respected people in this community who served the legislature, it will tell you that people who see this issue for what it is, it's an end to the kind of nastiness that has permeated our politics at the national level as well as the state level.
I was mentioning Joe Biden specifically said to me when I asked him at an event last summer if he supported open primaries, he said, absolutely yes, and it's very helpful to me. So I don't think he'll go against us at the very least. It'd be lovely if he'd say something positive for it.
I think if I was advising a presidential candidate, I would say don't be against something that 65% of voters support.
Right.
That's good advice. Very good.
They're not asking my opinion.
My California legislative friends always say, I always ask them, how does it work in California? They say, well, they hate it, but the voters love it. And as another one said, it doesn't change who gets elected so much as it changes how they behave. Because they have to speak differently, think differently, and have to think to the broader universe. And they can't be, you know, the word in Florida is they can't be primaried. Yeah. It eliminates the pressure of, I'm going to primary you, because it doesn't work anymore if all voters are voting. It's as simple as that.
We heard a great report from Professor Christian Gross and Charles Munger at Stanford about just exactly what you're saying, Gene, is that once elected, representatives from top two states like California and Washington, they behave very differently than politicians elected in partisan states. Final question of the day, although I think she might have been cut off, but this is from Kelley Lane about some of the arguments being made by Democrats and Republicans that we should keep things the same. Kelley, are you still with us?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you
great.
so much.
Hi, Kelley. You have the floor.
Oh, I just wonder, you know, that's the argument that you hear, that there will be strategic, you know, there will be efforts for the other side, whichever that is, to come in and vote in that primary to skew things, that they're not voting for a candidate. And I mean, and we have to look at that. That's going to happen. But how do we address that that messaging? Like, how do we?
If I could weigh in, John, on that, is that I think that is an argument that's going to be made. It was made in California. It was made in Washington State. It was made, and frankly, there's an interesting study going on right in front of our eyes in Georgia. They have 2 U.S. Senate races. One of them is the traditional partisan primary. The other is the top 2 race because it's a vacancy it's being filled. I will say this. Everybody that predicted horrific outcomes in California because of top 2, both parties hated it. Both parties lobbied against it. Both parties said it was going to be terrible. It didn't turn out so terrible. The reality is that people figure it out. The games get identified. The people that really have support of the communities will deal with it. But the problem is so severe with the prevention of rational 30% of the non-party affiliated voters from participating, it's worth the risk. I think the risk is minor, but certainly games will be played in any system.
Just to add
John,
to
if
that,
I could add on to that.
Oh, go ahead.
There's two pieces to this. Number one is the structural component, which is, I think we've solved a lot of those gamesmanship problems by having a single primary that all of the candidates appear in and all the voters vote in. The other component is the educational one, which is really explaining to voters that we are no longer selecting a party's nominee for the office. We are now in a vetting process. So it's not a question of Republicans parachuting into a Democratic primary to play games or vice versa. This is everybody voting in the same primary. So if you try to play those games, you might wind up hurting your own candidate because you need to make sure your preferred candidate is within the top two to advance to the general election. So this is really about the educating voters about how the process has changed from a party selection, a private party selection device, to a candidate vetting process, regardless of party affiliation.
If I can weigh in here, because I've been in these primary battles, what's going to happen is you're going to have a selection process within their own parties. Whoever the incoming speaker is in the Florida House will decide who he wants the nominee in. The Democrats will do the same, but it's going to give power to the independent NPA voters to then decide. And then if it goes to a second, because you have spoilers, it will also modify that. You're still going to have the parties trying to weigh in the primary, but what this is going to do is it's going to mitigate the amount of help that those party leaders can give. It will emasculate the party bosses, which is a good thing.
All right, we have 90 seconds left. Here's what I want to do. We're at 19,000. With Marcus's match, we've raised another 9. I'd like to get us to the full 20. Thank you, Rich Socolow, for your leadership of pushing that. Any last minute pledges? Take these last 60 seconds and get us into, put them in the chat so we can get to the full 20,000. We will be following up with detailed instructions for how to give at allvotersvote.org. Final question for you guys, and this is from Bill Van Emberg. He wants to know what needs to happen to change federal elections to move them to the top 2 systems. Short answer on that, and then we have to go.
$7 million more to get 1.1 million signatures next year around. You can only do one at a time in Florida.
And we do have the Second Amendment. It's already drafted and ready to go. We just had to pick the state horse because we can only run one at a time.
So win state, then do federal.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, we hit our 20,000. Thanks, everybody. This is great. This is great work. Mike, Gene, Steve,
John, I would
Glenn.
always make the point that we just need another $6,980,000 and we're there.
Well, Gene, we're doing another Zoom call on Thursday, and we hope to raise the remaining $6 million there. So
we got a ways to go, but
by the end of the week. Thank you, everybody. This has been great. Thank you, Mike, Gene,
Steve,
and Glenn, and we'll be in touch soon. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all. Stay safe and well.